Agatha Christie, The Shadow on the Glass. "Listen to this," said Lady Cynthia Doctor. She read aloud from the journal she held in her hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Unton are entertaining a party at Greenways house this week. Amongst the guests are Lady Cynthia Doctor, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Scott, Major Porter, DSO, Mrs. Staverton, Captain Allinson, and Mr. Sawyer." "It's as well," remarked Lady Cynthia, casting away the paper, "to know what we're in for. But they have made a mess of things." Her companion, that same Mr. Sawyer whose name figured at the end of the list of guests, looked at her interrogatively. It had been said that if Mr. Sawyer were found at the houses of those rich who had newly arrived, it was a sign either that the cooking was unusually good or that a drama of human life was to be enacted there. Mr. Sawyer was abnormally interested in the comedies and tragedies of his fellow men. Lady Cynthia, who was a middle-aged woman with a hard face and a liberal allowance of makeup, tapped him smartly with the newest thing in parasols, which lay rakishly across her knee. "Don't pretend you don't understand me, you do perfectly. What's more, I believe you're here on purpose to see the fur fly," Mr. Sawyer protested vigorously. He didn't know what she was talking about. "I'm talking about Richard Scott. Do you pretend you've never heard of him?" "No, of course not. He's the big game man, isn't he?" "That's it. Great big bears and tigers, etc., as the song says. Of course, he's a great lion himself just now. The Antons would naturally be mad to get hold of him. And the bride? A charming child, oh, quite. A charming child, but so naive, only 20, you know. And he must be at least 45. "Mrs. Scott seems to be very charming," said Mr. Sawyer sedately. "Yes, poor child." "Why poor child?" Lady Cynthia cast him a look of reproach and went on, approaching the point at issue in her own manner. "Porter's all right, a dull dog though. Another of these African hunters, all sunburnt and silent. Second fiddle to Richard Scott, and always has been. Lifelong friends and all that sort of thing. When I come to think of it, I believe they were together on that trip." "Which trip?" "The trip. The Miss Staverton trip. You'll be saying next you've never heard of Mrs. Staverton." "I have heard of Mrs. Staverton," said Mr. Sathwa almost with unwillingness, and he and Lady Cynthia exchanged glances. "It's so exactly like the Anants," wailed the latter. "They are absolutely hopeless socially, I mean. The idea of asking those two together. Of course, they'd heard that Mrs. Staverton was a sportswoman and a traveler and all that, and about her book. People like the Untons don't even begin to realize what pitfalls there are. I've been running them myself for the last year, and what I've gone through, nobody knows. One has to be constantly at their elbow. Don't do that. You can't do this. Thank goodness I'm through with it now. Not that we've quarreled. Oh no, I never quarrel. But somebody else can take on the job. As I've always said, I can put up with vulgarity, but I can't stand meanness." After this somewhat cryptic utterance, Lady Cynthia was silent for a moment, ruminating on the Anant's meanness as displayed to herself. "If I'd still been running the show for them," she went on presently, "I should have said quite firmly and plainly, you can't ask Mrs. Staverton with the Richard Scotts. She and he were once," she stopped eloquently. "But were they once?" asked Mr. Sathwa. "My dear man, it's well known. That trip into the interior. I'm surprised. The woman had the audacity to accept the invitation." "Perhaps she didn't know the others were coming," suggested Mr. Sawyer. "Perhaps she did, that's far more likely. You think she's what I call a dangerous woman? The sort of woman who'd stop at nothing? I wouldn't be in Richard Scott's shoes this weekend, and his wife knows nothing." "You think?" "I'm certain of it. But I suppose some kind friend will enlighten her sooner or later. Here's Jimmy Allinson, such a nice boy. He saved my life in Egypt last winter. I was so bored, you know. "Hello, Jimmy, come here at once." Captain Allinson obeyed, dropping down on the turf beside her. He was a handsome young fellow of 30, with white teeth and an infectious smile. "I'm glad somebody wants me," he observed. "The Scots are doing the turtle-dove stunt, 2 required, not 3. Porter's devouring the field, and I've been in mortal danger of being entertained by my hostess." He laughed. Lady Cynthia laughed with him. Mr. Sawyer, who was in some ways a little old-fashioned, so much so that he seldom made fun of his host and hostess until after he had left their house, remained grave. "Poor Jimmy," said Lady Cynthia, "mine not to reason why, mine but to swiftly fly. I had a narrow escape of being told the family ghost story." "An unknown ghost?" said Lady Cynthia. "Or screaming?" "Not an unknown ghost," said Mr. Sawyer. "A Greenways ghost. They bought it with the house." "Of course," said Lady Cynthia. "I remember now. But it doesn't clank chains, does it? It's only something to do with a window." Jimmy Allinson looked up quickly. "A window?" But for the moment, Mr. Sawyer did not answer. He was looking over Jimmy's head at 3 figures approaching from the direction of the house, a slim girl between 2 men. There was a superficial resemblance between the men, both were tall and dark, with bronzed faces and quick eyes, but, looked at more closely, the resemblance vanished. Richard Scott, hunter and explorer, was a man of extraordinarily vivid personality. He had a manner that radiated magnetism. John Porter, his friend and fellow hunter, was a man of square build with an impassive, rather wooden face and very thoughtful gray eyes. He was a quiet man, content always to play second fiddle to his friend. And between these two walked Moira Scott, who until 3 months ago had been Moira O'Connell, a slender figure, big wistful brown eyes, and golden red hair that stood out around her small face like a saint's halo. "That child mustn't be hurt," said Mr. Sawyer to himself. "It would be abominable that a child like that should be hurt." Lady Cynthia greeted the newcomers with a wave of the latest thing in parasols. "Sit down and don't interrupt," she said. "Mr. Sawyer is telling us a ghost story." "I love ghost stories," said Moira Scott. She dropped down on the grass. "The ghost of Greenways house?" asked Richard Scott. "Yes, you know about it," Scott nodded. "I used to stay here in the old days," he explained, "before the Elliots had to sell up. The Watching Cavalier." "That's it, isn't it, the Watching Cavalier," said his wife softly. "I like that. It sounds interesting. Please, go on," but Mr. Sawyer seemed somewhat loath to do so. He assured her that it was not really interesting at all. "Now you've done it, Satwa," said Richard Scott sardonically. That hint of reluctance clinches it, in response to popular clamor. Mr. Sawyer was forced to speak. "It's really very uninteresting," he said apologetically. "I believe the original story centers around a Cavalier ancestor of the Elliot family. His wife had a Roundhead lover. The husband was killed by the lover in an upstairs room, and the guilty pair fled. But as they fled, they looked back at the house and saw the face of the dead husband at the window, watching them. That is the legend. But the ghost story is only concerned with a pane of glass in the window of that particular room, on which is an irregular stain, almost imperceptible from near at hand, but which from far away certainly gives the effect of a man's face looking out." "Which window is it?" asked Mrs. Scott, looking up at the house. "You can't see it from here," said Mr. Sawyer. "It is round the other side but was boarded up from the inside some years ago, 40 years ago, I think, to be accurate." "What did they do that for?" "I thought you said the ghost didn't walk." "It doesn't," Mr. Sawyer assured her. I suppose there grew to be a superstitious feeling about it, that's all." Then, deftly enough, he succeeded in turning the conversation. Jimmy Allinson was perfectly ready to hold forth upon Egyptians, sand divers, frauds most of them, ready enough to tell you vague things about the past but won't commit themselves as to the future. I should have thought it was usually the other way about, remarked John Porter. It's illegal to tell the future in this country, isn't it? Said Richard Scott. Moira persuaded a gypsy into telling her fortune, but the woman gave her her shilling back and said there was nothing doing, or words to that effect. Perhaps she saw something so frightful that she didn't like to tell it me, said Moira. Don't pile on the agony, Mrs. Scott, said Alanson lightly. I for one refuse to believe that an unlucky fate is hanging over you. I wonder, thought Mr. Sawyer to himself. I wonder. Then he looked up sharply. 2 women were coming from the house, a short stout woman with black hair, inappropriately dressed in jade green, and a tall slim figure in creamy white. The first woman was his hostess, Mrs. Unton. The second was a woman he had often heard of but never met. Here's Mrs. Stavin, announced Mrs. Unton in a tone of great satisfaction. All friends here, I think. These people have an uncanny gift for saying just the most awful things they can, murmured Lady Cynthia. But Mr. Sawyer was not listening, he was watching. Mrs. Staverton, very easy, very natural, her careless, "Hello Richard, ages since we met. Sorry I couldn't come to the wedding. Is this your wife? You must be tired of meeting all your husband's weather-beaten old friends." Moira's response was suitable, rather shy. The elder woman's swift, appraising glance moved lightly to another old friend. "Hello John," in the same easy tone but with a subtle difference in it, a warming quality that had been absent before. And then that sudden smile, it transformed her. Lady Cynthia had been quite right, a dangerous woman. Very fair, deep blue eyes, not the traditional coloring of the siren. A face almost haggard in repose. A woman with a slow, dragging voice and a sudden, dazzling smile. Iris Staverton sat down. She became, naturally and inevitably, the center of the group, so you felt it would always be. Mr. Sawyer was recalled from his thoughts by Major Porter suggesting a stroll. Mr. Sawyer, who was not, as a general rule, much given to strolling, acquiesced. The 2 men sauntered off together across the lawn. "Very interesting story of yours just now," said the Major. "I will show you the window," said Mr. Sawyer. He led the way round to the west side of the house. Here, there was a small formal garden, the Privy Garden, it was always called, and there was some point in the name, for it was surrounded by high hedges, and even the entrance to it ran zigzag between the same high, prickly hedges. Once inside, it was very charming, with an old-world charm of formal flower beds, flagged paths, and a low stone seat exquisitely carved. When they had reached the center of the garden, Mr. Sawyer turned and pointed up at the house. The length of Greenways' house ran north and south. In this narrow west wall, there was only one window, a window on the first floor almost overgrown by ivy, with grimy panes, and which you could just see was boarded up on the inside. "There you are," said Mr. Sawyer, craning his neck. A little porter looked up. "I can see a kind of discoloration on one of the panes, nothing more." "We're too near," said Mr. Sawyer. "There's a clearing higher up in the woods where you get a really good view." He led the way out of the Privy Garden and, turning sharply to the left, struck into the woods. A certain enthusiasm of showmanship possessed him, and he hardly noticed that the man at his side was absent and inattentive. They had, of course, to make another window when they boarded up this one, he explained. "The new one faces south, overlooking the lawn where we were sitting just now. I rather fancy the Scots have the room in question. That is why I didn't want to pursue the subject." Mrs. Scott might have felt nervous if she had realized that she was sleeping in what might be called the haunted room. "Yes, I see," said Porter. Mr. Sawyer looked at him sharply and realized that the other had not heard a word of what he was saying. "Very interesting," said Porter. He slashed with his stick at some tall foxgloves and, frowning, he said, she ought not to have come. She ought never to have come. People often spoke after this fashion to Mr. Sawyer. He seemed to matter so little, to have so negative a personality. He was merely a glorified listener. No, said Porter, she ought never to have come. Mr. Sawyer knew instinctively that it was not of Mrs. Scott he spoke. You think not? He asked. Porter shook his head as though in foreboding. I was on that trip, he said abruptly. The three of us went, Scott and I and Iris Sheck. A wonderful woman and a damned fine shot. He paused. What made them ask her? He finished abruptly. Mr. Sawyer shrugged his shoulders. Ignorance, he said. There's going to be trouble, said the other. We must stand by and do what we can, but surely Mrs. Staven, I'm talking of Scott. He paused. You see, there's Mrs. Scott to consider. Mr. Sawyer had been considering her all along, but he did not think it was necessary to say so since the other man had so clearly forgotten her until this minute. How did Scott meet his wife? He asked. Last winter in Cairo. A quick business, they were engaged in 3 weeks and married in 6. She seems to me very charming. She is, no doubt about it, and he adores her, but that will make no difference, and again Major Porter repeated to himself, using the pronoun that meant to him one person only. Hang it all, she shouldn't have come. Just then they stepped out upon a high grassy knoll at some little distance from the house. With, again, something of the pride of the showman, Mr. Sawyer stretched out his arm. Look, he said. It was fast growing dusk. The window could still be plainly descried, and apparently pressed against one of the panes was a man's face, surmounted by a plumed cavalier's hat. Very curious, said Porter, really very curious. What will happen when that pane of glass gets smashed someday? Mr. Sawyer smiled. That is one of the most interesting parts of the story. That pane of glass has been replaced, to my certain knowledge, at least 11 times, perhaps oftener. The last time was 12 years ago, when the then owner of the house determined to destroy the myth. But it's always the same. The stain reappears, not all at once. The discoloration spreads gradually. It takes a month or 2 as a rule. For the first time. Porter showed signs of real interest. He gave a sudden quick shiver. Damned odd, these things. No accounting for them. What's the real reason for having the room boarded up inside? Well, an idea got about that the room was unlucky. The Eames were in it just before the divorce. Then Stanley and his wife were staying here and had that room when he ran off with his chorus girl. Porter raised his eyebrows. I see. Danger not to life, but to morals. And now, thought Mr. Sawyer to himself, the Scots have it, I wonder. They retraced their steps. In silence to the house, walking almost noiselessly on the soft turf, each absorbed in his own thoughts, they became unwittingly eavesdroppers. They were rounding the corner of the holly hedge when they heard Iris Statton's voice, raised fierce and clear, from the depths of the privy garden. You shall be sorry, sorry for this. Scott's voice answered low and uncertain so that the words could not be distinguished, and then the woman's voice rose again, speaking words that they were to remember later. Jealousy, it drives one to the devil. It is the devil. It can drive one to black murder. Be careful, Richard, for God's sake, be careful. And then, on that, she had come out of the privy garden ahead of them and on round the corner of the house without seeing them. Walking swiftly, almost running, like a woman hag-ridden and pursued. Mr. S.A. thought again of Lady Cynthia's words, a dangerous woman. For the first time, he had a premonition of tragedy coming swift and inexorable, not to be gainsaid. Yet that evening, he felt ashamed of his fears. Everything seemed normal and pleasant. Mrs. Staven, with her easy insouciance, showed no sign of strain. Moira Scott was her charming, unaffected self. The two women appeared to be getting on very well. Richard Scott himself seemed to be in boisterous spirits. The most worried-looking person was stout Mrs. Unton. She confided at length in Mr. S.A., "Think it silly or not as you like, there's something giving me the creeps. And I'll tell you frankly, I've sent for the glazier unbeknown to Ned, the glazier to put a new pane of glass in that window. It's all very well. Ned's proud of it, says it gives the house a tone. I don't like it, I tell you flat. We'll have a nice plain modern pane of glass with no nasty stories attached to it." "You forget," said Mr. S.A., "or perhaps you don't know, the stain comes back." "That's as it may be," said Mrs. Unton, "all I can say is if it does, it's against nature." Mr. Sawyer raised his eyebrows but did not reply. "And what if it does?" pursued Mrs. Unton defiantly. "We're not so bankrupt, Ned and I, that we can't afford a new pane of glass every month or every week if need be, for that matter." Mr. Sawyer did not meet the challenge. He had seen too many things crumple and fall before the power of money to believe that even a cavalier ghost could put up a successful fight. Nevertheless, he was interested by Mrs. Unton's manifest uneasiness. Even she was not exempt from the tension in the atmosphere, only she attributed it to an attenuated ghost story, not to the clash of personalities amongst her guests. Mr. Sawyer was fated to hear yet another scrap of conversation which threw light upon the situation. He was going up the wide staircase to bed. John Porter and Mrs. Staven were sitting together in an alcove of the big hall. She was speaking with a faint irritation in her golden voice. "I hadn't the least idea the Scotts were going to be here. I dare say if I had known, I shouldn't have come. But I can assure you, my dear John, that now I am here, I'm not going to run away." Mr. Sawyer passed on up the staircase, out of earshot. He thought to himself, "I wonder now, how much of that is true? Did she know? I wonder what's going to come of it." He shook his head. In the clear light of the morning, he felt that he had perhaps been a little melodramatic in his imaginings of the evening before. A moment of strain, yes, certainly inevitable under the circumstances, but nothing more. People adjusted themselves. His fancy that some great catastrophe was pending was nerves, pure nerves, or possibly liver. Yes, that was it, liver. He was due at Carlsbad in another fortnight on his own account. He proposed a little stroll that evening just as it was growing dusk. He suggested to Major Porter that they should go up to the clearing and see if Mrs. Unton had been as good as her word and had a new pane of glass put in. To himself, he said, "Exercise, that's what I need, exercise." The two men walked slowly through the woods. Porter, as usual, was taciturn. "I can't help feeling," said Mr. Sawyer loquaciously, "that we were a little foolish in our imaginings yesterday, expecting trouble, you know. After all, people have to behave themselves, swallow their feelings, and that sort of thing." "Perhaps," said P. After a minute or two, he added, "Civilized people, you mean?" People who've lived outside civilization a good deal sometimes go back, revert, whatever you call it." They emerged onto the grassy knoll. Mr. Sawyer was breathing rather fast. He never enjoyed going uphill. He looked towards the window. The face was still there, more lifelike than ever. "Our hostess has repented, I see," Porter threw at only a cursory glance. "Anon cut up rough, I expect," he said indifferently. "He's the sort of man who is willing to be proud of another family's ghost and who isn't going to run the risk of having it driven away when he's paid spot cash for it." He was silent a minute or two, staring not at the house but at the thick undergrowth by which they were surrounded. "Has it ever struck you," he said, "that civilization's damned dangerous?" "Dangerous?" Such a revolutionary remark shocked Mr. Sawyer to the core. "Yes, there are no safety valves, you see." He turned abruptly, and they descended the path by which they had come. I really am quite at a loss to understand you, said Mr. Sawyer, pattering along with nimble steps to keep up with the others' strides. Reasonable people, Porter laughed a short, disconcerting laugh. Then he looked at the correct little gentleman by his side. You think it's all bunkum on my part, Mr. Sathwaite, but there are people, you know, who can tell you when a storm's coming. They feel it beforehand in the air, and other people can foretell trouble. There's trouble coming now, Mr. Sawyer, big trouble. It may come any minute. It may. He stopped dead, clutching Mr. Sawyer's arm, and in that tense minute of silence, it came, the sound of 2 shots, and following them, a cry in a woman's voice. My God, cried Porter. It's come. He raced down the path, Mr. Sawyer panting behind him. In a minute, they came out onto the lawn close by the hedge of the Privy Garden. At the same time, Richard Scott and Mr. Unton came around the opposite corner of the house. They halted, facing each other to the left and right of the entrance to the Privy Garden. It came from in there, said Unton, pointing with a flabby hand. We must see, said Porter. He led the way into the enclosure. As he rounded the last bend of the holly hedge, he stopped dead. Mr. Sawyer peered over his shoulder. A loud cry burst from Richard Scott. There were 3 people in the Privy Garden. 2 of them lay on the grass near the stone seat, a man and a woman. The third was Mrs. Staven. She was standing quite close to them by the holly hedge, gazing with horror-stricken eyes and holding something in her right hand. Iris, cried Porter. Iris. For God's sake, what's that you've got in your hand? She looked down at it, then with a kind of wonder, an unbelievable indifference. It's a pistol, she said wonderingly, and then, after what seemed an interminable time but was in reality only a few seconds, I picked it up. Mr. Sawyer had gone forward to where Unton and Scott were kneeling on the turf. A doctor, the latter was murmuring. We must have a doctor. But it was too late for any doctor. Jimmy Allinson, who had complained that the sand diviners hedged about the future, and Moira Scott, to whom the gypsy had returned a shilling, lay there in the last great stillness. It was Richard Scott who completed a brief examination. The iron nerve of the man showed in this crisis. After the first cry of agony, he was himself again. He laid his wife gently down again, shot from behind, he said briefly, the bullet has passed right through her. Then he handled Jimmy Allinson. The wound here was in the breast, and the bullet was lodged in the body. John Porter came towards them. Nothing should be touched, he said sternly. The police must see it all exactly as it is now. The police, said Richard Scott, his eyes lit up with a sudden flame as he looked at the woman standing by the holly hedge. He made a step in that direction, but at the same time, John Porter also moved so as to bar his way. For a moment, it seemed as though there was a duel of eyes between the 2 friends. Porter very quietly shook his head. No. Richard, he said. It looks like it, but you're wrong. Richard Scott spoke with difficulty, moistening his dry lips. Then why has she got that in her hand? And again, Iris Staven said in the same lifeless tone, I picked it up. The police, said Annon, rising. We must send for the police at once. You will telephone, perhaps, Scott? Someone should stay here. Yes, I am sure someone should stay here. In his quiet, gentlemanly manner, Mr. Sawyer offered to do so. His host accepted the offer with manifest relief. The ladies, he explained. I must break the news to the ladies, Lady Cynthia and my dear wife. Mr. Sawyer stayed in the Privy Garden, looking down on the body of that which had once been Moira Scott. Poor child, he said to himself. Poor child. He quoted to himself the tag about the evil men do living after them. For was not Richard Scott, in a way, responsible for his innocent wife's death? They would hang Iris Stavin, he supposed. Not that he liked to think of it, but was not at least a part of the blame laid at the man's door? The evil that men do, and the girl, the innocent girl, had paid. He looked down at her with very deep pity, her small face so white and wistful, a half-smile on the lips still, the ruffled golden hair, the delicate ear. There was a spot of blood on the lobe of it. With an inner feeling of being something of a detective, Mr. Sawyer deduced an earring torn away in her fall. He craned his neck forward. Yes, he was right. There was a small pearl drop hanging from the other ear. Poor child, poor child. And now, sir, said Inspector Winkfield. They were in the library. The inspector, a shrewd-looking, forceful man of 40-odd, was concluding his investigations. He had questioned most of the guests and had by now pretty well made up his mind on the case. He was listening to what Major Porter and Mr. Sawyer had to say. Mr. Unton sat heavily in a chair, staring with protruding eyes at the opposite wall. As I understand it. Gentlemen, said the inspector, you'd been for a walk. You were returning to the house by a path that winds around the left side of what they call the Privy Garden. Is that correct? Quite correct, Inspector. You heard 2 shots and a woman scream. Yes. You then ran as fast as you could, emerged from the woods, and made your way to the entrance of the Privy Garden. If anybody had left that garden, they could only do so by one entrance. The holly bushes are impossible. If anyone had run out of the garden and turned to the right, he would have been met by Mr. Unton and Mr. Scott. If he had turned to the left, he could not have done so without being seen by you. Is that right? That is so, said Major Porter. His face was very white. That seems to settle it, said the inspector. Mr. and Mrs. Unton and Lady Cynthia Doctor were sitting on the lawn. Mr. Scott was in the billiard room, which opens onto that lawn. At 10 minutes to 6, Mrs. Stavin came out of the house, spoke a word or two to those sitting there, and went round the corner of the house towards the Privy Garden. 2 minutes later, the shots were heard. Mr. Scott rushed out of the house and, together with Mr. Unton, ran to the Privy Garden. The same time you and Mr. Sawyer arrived from the opposite direction, Mrs. Staverton was in the Privy Garden with a pistol in her hand from which 2 shots had been fired. As I see it, she shot the lady first from behind as she was sitting on the bench. Then Captain Allinson sprang up and went for her, and she shot him in the chest as he came towards her. I understand that there had been a previous attachment between her and Mr. Richard Scott. That's a damned lie, said Porter. His voice rang out hoarse and defiant. The inspector said nothing, merely shook his head. What is her own story? Asked Mr. Sawyer. She says that she went into the Privy Garden to be quiet for a little. Just before she rounded the last hedge, she heard the shots. She came around the corner, saw the pistol lying at her feet, and picked it up. No one passed her, and she saw no one in the garden but the 2 victims. The inspector gave an eloquent pause. That's what she says, and although I cautioned her, she insisted on making a statement. If she said that, said Major Porter, and his face was still deadly white, she was speaking the truth. I know Iris Stavin well, sir, said the inspector. There'll be plenty of time to go into all that later. In the meantime, I've got my duty to do. With an abrupt movement, Porter turned to Mr. Sawyer. Can't you help? Can't you do something? Mr. Sawyer could not help feeling immensely flattered. He had been appealed to, the most insignificant of men, and by a man like John Porter. He was just about to flutter out a regretful reply when the butler, Thompson, entered with a card upon a salver, which he took to his master with an apologetic cough. Mr. Unton was still sitting huddled up in a chair, taking no part in the proceedings. I told the gentleman you would probably not be able to see him, sir, said Thompson, but he insisted that he had an appointment and that it was most urgent. Unton took the card. Mr. Harley Quinn, he read. I remember he was to see me about a picture. I did make an appointment, but as things are, but Mr. Sathwa had started forward. "Mr. Harley Quinn, did you say?" he cried. "How extraordinary! How very extraordinary! Major Porter, you asked me if I could help you. I think I can. This Mr. Quinn is a friend, or I should say an acquaintance, of mine. He is a most remarkable man, one of these amateur solvers of crime, I suppose," remarked the inspector disparagingly. "No," said Mr. Sawyer, "he is not that kind of man at all. But he has a power, an almost uncanny power, of showing you what you have seen with your own eyes, of making clear to you what you have heard with your own ears. Let us, at any rate, give him an outline of the case and hear what he has to say." Mr. Unton glanced at the inspector, who merely snorted and looked at the ceiling. Then the former gave a short nod to Thompson, who left the room and returned, ushering in a tall, slim stranger. "Mr. Unton." The stranger shook him by the hand. "I am sorry to intrude upon you at such a time. We must leave our little picture chat until another time. Ah, my friend Mr. Sawyer, still as fond of the drama as ever." A faint smile played for a minute around the stranger's lips as he said these last words. "Mr. Quinn," said Mr. Sathwa impressively, "we have a drama here. We are in the midst of one. I should like, and my friend Major Porter would like, to have your opinion of it." Mr. Quinn sat down. The red-shaded lamp threw a broad band of colored light over the checked pattern of his overcoat and left his face in shadow, almost as though he wore a mask. Succinctly, Mr. Sathwa recited the main points of the tragedy. Then he paused breathlessly, awaiting the words of the oracle. But Mr. Quinn merely shook his head. "A sad story," he said. "A very sad and shocking tragedy. The lack of motive makes it very intriguing." Unton stared at him. "You don't understand." He said Mrs. Staven was heard to threaten Richard Scott. She was bitterly jealous of his wife. "Jealousy, I agree," said Mr. Quinn. "Jealousy or demoniac possession, it's all the same. But you misunderstand me. I was not referring to the murder of Mrs. Scott but to that of Captain Allinson." "You're right," cried Porter, springing forward. "There's a flaw there. If Iris had ever contemplated shooting Mrs. Scott, she'd have got her alone somewhere. No, we're on the wrong tack, and I think I see another solution. Only those three people went into the Privy Garden, that is indisputable, and I don't intend to dispute it. But I reconstruct the tragedy differently. Supposing Jimmy Allinson shoots first Mrs. Scott and then himself. That's possible, isn't it? He flings the pistol from him as he falls. Mrs. Staven finds it lying on the ground and picks it up, just as she said. How's that? The inspector shook his head. Won't wash, Major Porter. If Captain Allinson had fired that shot close to his body, the cloth would have been singed. He might have held the pistol at arm's length. Why should he? No sense in it. Besides, there's no motive. Might have gone off his head suddenly, muttered Porter, but without any great conviction. He fell to silence again, suddenly rousing himself to say defiantly, "Well, Mr. Quinn." The latter shook his head. "I'm not a magician. I'm not even a criminologist. But I will tell you one thing, I believe in the value of impressions. In any time of crisis, there is always one moment that stands out from all the others, one picture that remains when all else has faded. Mr. Sawyer is, I think, likely to have been the most unprejudiced observer of those present. Will you cast your mind back, Mr. Sawyer, and tell us the moment that made the strongest impression on you? Was it when you heard the shots? Was it when you first saw the dead bodies? Was it when you first observed? The pistol in Mrs. Staten's hand cleared your mind of any preconceived standard of values and tell us." Mr. Sawyer fixed his eyes on Mr. Quinn's face rather as a schoolboy might repeat a lesson of which he was not sure. "No," he said slowly, "it was not any of those. The moment that I shall always remember was when I stood alone by the bodies afterwards, looking down on Mrs. Scott. She was lying on her side, her hair was ruffled, there was a spot of blood on her little ear. And instantly, as he said it, he felt that he had said a significant thing. Blood on her ear? Yes, I remember, said Anand slowly. Her earring must have been torn out when she fell, explained Mr. Saw. But it sounded a little improbable as he said it. She was lying on her left side, said Porter. I suppose it was that ear. No, said Mr. Saw quickly, it was her right ear. The inspector coughed. I found this in the grass, he vouchsafed. He held up a loop of gold wire. But my God, man, cried Porter, the thing can't have been wrenched to pieces by a mere fall. It's more as though it had been shot away by a bullet. So it was, cried Mr. Sathwa. It was a bullet. It must have been. There were only 2 shots, said the inspector. A shot can't have grazed her ear and shot her in the back as well. And if one shot carried away the earring and the second shot killed her, it can't have killed Captain Allinson as well. Not unless he was standing close in front of her. Very close. Facing her as it might be. Oh, I know. Not even then. Unless, that is, unless she was in his arms, you were going to say, said Mr. Quinn with a queer little smile. Well, why not? Everyone stared at each other. The idea was so vitally strange to them. Allinson and Mrs. Scott? Mr. Unton voiced the same feeling. But they hardly knew each other, he said. I don't know, said Mr. Saw thoughtfully. They might have known each other better than. We thought Lady Cynthia said he saved her from being bored in Egypt last winter, and you, he turned to Porter, you told me that Richard Scott met his wife in Cairo last winter. They might have known each other very well indeed out there. They didn't seem to be together much, said Unton. No, they rather avoided each other. It was almost unnatural, now I come to think of it. They all looked at Mr. Quinn as if a little startled at the conclusions at which they had arrived so unexpectedly. Mr. Quinn rose to his feet. You see, he said, what Mr. Saw's impression has done for us. He turned to Unton. It is your turn now. I don't understand you. You were very thoughtful when I came into this room. I should like to know exactly what thought it was that obsessed you. Never mind if it has nothing to do with the tragedy. Never mind if it seems to you superstitious. Mr. Unton started ever so slightly. Tell us. I don't mind telling you, said Unton, though it's nothing to do with the business, and you'll probably laugh at me into the bargain. I was wishing that my M had left well alone and not replaced that pane of glass in the haunted window. I feel as though doing that has maybe brought a curse upon us. He was unable to understand why the 2 men opposite him stared so. But she hasn't replaced it yet, said Mr. Saw at last. Yes, she has. The man came first thing that morning. My God, said Porter, I begin to understand. That room, it's paneled, I suppose, not paper. Yes, but what does that? But Porter had swung out of the room. The other followed him. He went straight upstairs to the Scots' bedroom. It was a charming room, paneled in cream, with 2 windows facing south. Porter felt with his hands along the panels on the western wall. There's a spring somewhere, must be. Ah. There was a click, and a section of the paneling rolled back. It disclosed the grimy panes of the haunted window. One pane of glass was clean and new. Porter stooped quickly and picked up something. He held it out on the palm of his hand, it was a fragment of ostrich feather. Then he looked at Mr. Quinn. Mr. Quinn nodded. He went across to the hat cupboard in the bedroom. There were several hats in it, the dead woman's hats. He took out one with a large brim and curling feathers, an elaborate ascot hat. Mr. Quinn began speaking in a gentle, reflective voice. Let us suppose, said Mr. Quinn, a man who is by nature intensely jealous, a man who has stayed here in bygone years and knows the secret of the spring in the paneling. To amuse himself, he opens it one day and looks out over the privy garden. There, secure as they think from being overlooked, he sees his wife and another man. There can be no possible doubt in his mind as to the relations between them. He is mad with rage. What shall he do? An idea comes to him. He goes to the cupboard and puts on the hat with the brim and feathers. It is growing dusk, and he remembers the story of the stain on the glass. Anyone looking up at the window will see, as they think, the watching cavalier. Thus secure, he watches them, and at the moment they are clasped in each other's arms, he shoots. He is a good shot, a wonderful shot. As they fall, he fires once more. That shot carries away the earring. He flings the pistol out of the window into the privy garden. Rushes downstairs and out through the billiard room. Porter took a step towards him, but, he let her be accused, he cried. He stood by and let her be accused. Why? Why? I think I know why, said Mr. Quinn. I should guess, it's only guesswork on my part, mind, that Richard Scott was once madly in love with Iris Staverton. So madly that even meeting her years afterwards stirred up the embers of jealousy again. I should say that Iris Staverton once fancied that she might love him, that she went on a hunting trip with him and another, and she came back in love with the better man, muttered Porter, dazed. You mean, yes, said Mr. Quinn with a faint smile. I mean you. He paused a minute and then said, if I were you, I should go to her now. I will, said Porter. He turned and left the room. Agatha Christie at the Bells in Motley. Mr. Sawyer was annoyed. Altogether, it had been an unfortunate day. They had started late, there had been 2 punctures already, and finally, they had taken the wrong turning and lost themselves amidst the wilds of Salisbury Plain. Now it was close on 8 o'clock. They were still a matter of 40 miles from Marwick Manor, where they were bound. And a 3rd puncture had supervened to render matters still more trying. Mr. Sawyer, looking like some small bird whose plumage had been ruffled, walked up and down in front of the village garage whilst his chauffeur conversed in low undertones with the local expert. Half an hour at least, said that worthy, pronouncing judgment. And lucky at that, supplemented Masters, the chauffeur. More like 3/4, if you ask me. What is this place anyway? Demanded Mr. Sawyer fretfully. Being a little gentleman considerate of the feelings of others, he substituted the word place for the godforsaken hole which had first risen to his lips. Kirtlington Mallet. Mr. Sawyer was not much wiser. And yet a faint familiarity seemed to linger around the name. He looked around him disparagingly. Kirtlington Mallet seemed to consist of one straggling street, the garage, and the post office on one side of it, balanced by 3 indeterminate shops on the other side. Farther down the road, however, Mr. Sawyer perceived something that creaked and swung in the wind, and his spirits rose ever so slightly. There's an inn here, I see, he remarked. Bells and Motley, said the garage man. That's it. Yonder. If I might make a suggestion, sir, said Masters, why not try it? They would be able to give you some sort of a meal, no doubt not, of course, what you are accustomed to. He paused apologetically, for Mr. Sawyer was accustomed to the best cooking of continental chefs and had in his own service a cordon bleu to whom he paid a fabulous salary. We should be able to take the road again for another 3/4 of an hour, sir, I'm sure of that, and it's already past 8 o'clock. You could ring up Sir George Foster, sir, from the inn and acquaint him with the cause of our delay. You seem to think you can arrange everything, Masters, said Mr. Sathwa snappily. Masters, who did think so, maintained a respectful silence. Mr. Sathwa, in spite of his earnest wish to discountenance any suggestion that might possibly be made to him, he was in that mood, nevertheless looked down the road towards the creaking sign with faint inward approval. He was a man of bird-like appetite, an epicure, but even such men can be hungry. The Bells and Motley, he said, thoughtfully, that's an odd name for an inn. I don't know that I ever heard it before. There's odd folks come to it by all accounts, said the local man. He was bending over the wheel, and his voice came muffled and indistinct. Odd folks? Queried Mr. Sathwa. Now what do you mean by that? The other hardly seemed to know what he meant. Folks that come and go, that kind, he said vaguely. Mr. Sawyer reflected that people who come to an inn are almost of necessity those who come and go. The definition seemed to him to lack precision, but nevertheless his curiosity was stimulated. Somehow or other he had got to put in 3/4 of an hour. The Bells and Motley would be as good as anywhere else. With his usual small mincing steps, he walked away down the road. From afar there came a rumble of thunder. The mechanic looked up and spoke to Masters. There's a storm coming over, thought I could feel it in the air. Aye, said Masters, and 40 mil to go. Ah, said the other, there's no need to be hurrying over this job. You'll not be wanting to take the road till the storm's passed over. That little boss of yours doesn't look as though he'd relish being out in thunder and lightning. Hope they'll do him well at that place, muttered the chauffeur. I'll be pushing along there for a bite myself presently. Billy Jones is all right, said the garage man, keeps a good table. Mr. William Jones, a big, burly man of 50 and landlord of the Bells and Motley, was at this minute beaming ingratiatingly down on little Mr. Sawyer. Can do you a nice steak, sir, and fried potatoes, and as good a cheese as any gentleman could wish for. This way, sir, in the coffee room. We're not very full at present, the last of the fishing gentlemen just gone. A little later we'll be full again for the hunting. Only one gentleman here at present. Name of Quinn. Mr. Sathwa stopped dead. Quinn, he said excitedly, did you say Quinn? That's the name, sir. Friend of yours, perhaps? Yes, indeed. Oh yes, most certainly. Twittering with excitement, Mr. Sawyer hardly realized that the world might contain more than one man of that name. He had no doubts at all. In an odd way, the information fitted in with what the man at the garage had said, folks that come and go, a very apt description of Mr. Quinn. And the name of the inn too seemed a peculiarly fitting and appropriate one. Dear me, said Mr. Sathwa, what a very odd thing that we should meet like this. Mr. Harley Quinn, is it not? That's right, sir. This is the coffee room, sir. Ah, here is the gentleman. Tall, dark, smiling, the familiar figure of Mr. Quinn rose from the table at which he was sitting, and the well-remembered voice spoke. Ah, Mr. Sawyer, we meet again. An unexpected meeting. Mr. Sathwa was shaking him warmly by the hand. Delighted, I'm sure. A lucky breakdown for me, my car, you know. And you are staying here for long? One night only, then. I am indeed fortunate. Mr. Sawyer sat down opposite his friend with a little sigh of satisfaction and regarded the dark smiling face opposite him with a pleasurable expectancy. The other man shook his head gently. I assure you, he said, that I have not a bowl of goldfish or a rabbit to produce from my sleeve. Too bad, cried Mr. Sathwa, a little taken aback. Yes, I must confess I do rather adopt that attitude towards you, a man of magic. Ha ha. That is how I regard you, a man of magic. And yet, said Mr. Quinn, it is you who do the conjuring tricks, not I. Ah, said Mr. Sawyer eagerly, but I cannot do them without you. I lack, shall we say, inspiration. Mr. Quinn smilingly shook his head. That is too big a word. I speak the cue, that is all. The landlord came in at that minute with bread and a slab of yellow butter. As he set the things on the table, there was a vivid flash of lightning and a clap of thunder almost overhead. A wild night, gentlemen. On such a night, began Mr. Sathwa, and stopped. Funny now, said the landlord, unconscious of the question, if those weren't just the words I was going to use myself. It was just such a night as this when Captain Harwell brought his bride home, the very day before he disappeared forever. Ah, cried Mr. Sathwa suddenly. Of course. He had got the clue. True, he knew now why the name Kirtlington Mallet was familiar. 3 months before, he had read every detail of the astonishing disappearance of Captain Richard Harwell. Like other newspaper readers all over Great Britain, he had puzzled over the details of the disappearance and also, like every other Briton, had evolved his own theories. Of course, he repeated. It was at Kirtlington Mallet it happened. It was at this house he stayed for the hunting last winter, said the landlord. Oh, I knew him well, a fine, handsome young gentleman, and not one that you'd think had a care on his mind. He was done away with, that's my belief. Many is the time I've seen them come riding home together, he and Miss Ludo, and all the village saying there'd be a match come of it. And sure enough, so it did. A very beautiful young lady and well thought of, for all she was a Canadian and a stranger. Ah, there's some dark mystery there. We'll never know the rights of it. It broke her heart, it did, sure enough. You've heard as she sold the place up and gone abroad. Couldn't have borne to go on here with everyone staring and pointing after her through no fault of her own. Poor young dear, a black mystery, that's what it is. He shook his head, then, suddenly recollecting his duties, hurried from the room. A black mystery, said Mr. Quinn softly. His voice was provocative in Mr. Sawa's ears. Are you pretending that we could solve the mystery where Scotland Yard failed? He asked sharply. The other made a characteristic gesture. Why not? Time has passed, 3 months, that makes a difference. That is a curious idea of yours, said Mr. Sathwa slowly, that one sees things better afterwards than at the time. The longer the time that has elapsed, the more things fall into proportion. One sees them in their true relationship to one another. There was a silence which lasted for some minutes. I am not sure, said Mr. Sathwa in a hesitating voice, that I remember the facts clearly by now. I think you do, said Mr. Quinn quietly. It was all the encouragement Mr. Sathwa needed. His general role in life was that of listener and looker-on. Only in the company of Mr. Quinn was the position reversed. There, Mr. Quinn was the appreciative listener, and Mr. Saw took the center of the stage. It was just over a year ago, he said, that Ashley Gra passed into the possession of Miss Eleanor Ludo. It is a beautiful old house, but it had been neglected and allowed to remain empty for many years. It could not have found a better custodian. Miss Ludo was a French-Canadian. Her forebears were immigrants from the French Revolution and had handed down to her a collection of almost priceless French relics and antiques. She was a buyer and a collector also, with a very fine and discriminating taste. So much so that when she decided to sell Ashley Grange and everything it contained after the tragedy, Mr. Cyrus G. Bradburn, the American millionaire, made no bones about paying the fancy price of $60,000 for the Grange as it stood. Mr. Saw paused. I mention these things, he said apologetically, not because they are relevant to the story. Strictly speaking, they are not, but to convey an atmosphere, the atmosphere of young Mrs. Harwell. Mr. Quinn nodded. Atmosphere is always valuable, he said gravely. So we get a picture of this girl, continued the other, just 23, dark, beautiful, accomplished, nothing crude and unfinished about her, and rich. We must not forget that. She was an orphan. A Mrs. St. Clair, a lady of unimpeachable breeding and social standing, lived with her as duenna, but Eleanor Ludo had complete control of her own fortune. And fortune hunters are never hard to seek. At least a dozen impecunious young men were to be found dangling around her on all occasions, in the hunting field, in the ballroom, wherever she went. Young Lord Lean, the most eligible party in the country, is reported to have asked her to marry him. But she remained heart-free. That is, until the coming of Captain Richard Harwell. Captain Harwell had put up at the local inn for the hunting. He was a dashing rider to hounds, a handsome, laughing daredevil of a fellow. You remember the old saying, Mr. Quinn, happy the wooing that's not long doing. The adage was carried out, at least in part. At the end of 2 months, Richard Harwell and Eleanor Lutto were engaged. The marriage followed 3 months afterwards. The happy pair went abroad for a 2-week honeymoon and then returned to take up their residence at Ashley Grange. The landlord has just told us that it was on a night of storm such as this that they returned to their home. An omen, I wonder? Who can tell? Be that as it may, the following morning, very early, about 7:30, Captain Harwell was seen walking in the garden by one of the gardeners, John Matthias. He was bareheaded and was whistling. We have a picture there, a picture of light-heartedness, of careless happiness, and yet, from that minute, as far as we know, no one ever set eyes on Captain Richard Harwell again. Mr. Sawyer paused, pleasantly conscious of a dramatic moment. The admiring glance of Mr. Quinn gave him the tribute he needed. And he went on. The disappearance was remarkable, unaccountable. It was not till the following day that the distracted wife called in the police. As you know, they have not succeeded in solving the mystery. There have, I suppose, been theories, asked Mr. Quinn. Oh, theories, I grant you. Theory number 1, that Captain Harwell had been murdered, done away with. But if so, where was the body? It could hardly have been spirited away, and besides, what motive was there? As far as was known, Captain Harwell had not an enemy in the world. He paused abruptly, as though uncertain. Mr. Quinn leaned forward. You are thinking, he said softly, of young Stephen Grant. I am, admitted Mr. Sawyer. Stephen Grant, if I remember rightly, had been in charge of Captain Harwell's horses and had been discharged by his master for some trifling offense. On the morning after the homecoming, very early, Stephen Grant was seen in the vicinity of Ashley Grange and could give no good account of his presence there. He was detained by the police as being concerned in the disappearance of Captain Harwell, but nothing could be proved against him, and he was eventually discharged. It is true that he might be supposed to bear a grudge against Captain Harwell for his summary dismissal, but the motive was undeniably of the flimsiest. I suppose the police felt they must do something, you see. As I said just now, Captain Harwell had not an enemy in the world, as far as was known, said Mr. Quinn reflectively. Mr. Sathwa nodded appreciatively. We are coming to that. What, after all, was known of Captain Harwell? When the police came to look into his antecedents, they were confronted with a singular paucity of material. Who was Richard Harwell? Where did he come from? He had appeared literally out of the blue, as it seemed. He was a magnificent rider and apparently well off. Nobody in Kirtlington Mallet had bothered to inquire further. Miss Lutto had had no parents or guardians to make inquiries into the prospects and standing of her fiancé. She was her own mistress. The police theory at this point was clear enough, a rich girl and an impudent impostor, the old story. But it was not quite that true. Miss Lutto had no parents or guardians, but she had an excellent firm of solicitors in London who acted for her. Their evidence made the mystery deeper. Eleanor Lutto had wished to settle a sum outright upon her prospective husband, but he had refused. He himself was well off, he declared. It was proved conclusively that Harwell never had a penny of his wife's money. Her fortune was absolutely intact. He was therefore no common swindler. But was his object a refinement of the art? Did he propose blackmail at some future date if Eleanor Harwell should wish to marry some other man? I will admit that something of that kind seemed to me the most likely solution. It has always seemed so to me until tonight. Mr. Quinn leaned forward, prompting him. Tonight? Tonight, I'm not satisfied with that. How did he manage to disappear so suddenly and completely at that hour in the morning with every laborer bestirring himself and tramping to work bareheaded too? There is no doubt about the latter point since the gardener saw him. Yes, the gardener, John Matthias. Was there anything there, I wonder? The police would not overlook him, said Mr. Quinn. They questioned him closely. He never wavered in his statement, his wife bore him out. He left his cottage at 7 to attend to the greenhouses. He returned at 20 minutes to 8. The servants in the house heard the front door slam at about 7:15. That fixes the time when Captain Harwell left the house. Ah, yes, I know what you are thinking. Do you, I wonder? Said Mr. Quinn. I fancy so. Time enough for Matthias to have made away with his master. But why, man, why? And if so, where did he hide the body? The landlord came in bearing a tray. Sorry to have kept you so long, gentlemen. He set upon the table a mammoth steak and beside it a dish filled to overflowing with crisp brown potatoes. The odor from the dishes was pleasant to Mr. Sawa's nostrils. He felt gracious. This looks excellent, he said, most excellent. We have been discussing the disappearance of Captain Harwell. What became of the gardener? Matthias took a place in SA, I believe. Didn't care to stay hereabouts. There were some as looked askance at him, you understand. Not that I ever believed he had anything to do with it. Mr. Sawa helped himself to steak. Mr. Quinn followed suit. The landlord seemed disposed to linger and chat. Mr. Sawa had no objection. On the contrary. This Matthias now, he said, what kind of a man was he? Middle-aged chap must have been a powerful fellow once, but bent and crippled with rheumatism. He had that mortal bad. Was laid up many a time with it, unable to do any work. For my part, I think it was sheer kindness on Miss Elena's part to keep him on. He'd outgrown his usefulness as a gardener, though his wife managed to make herself useful up at the house being a cook. She had and was always willing to lend a hand. What sort of a woman was she? Asked Mr. Sawa quickly. The landlord's answer disappointed him. A plain body, middle-aged and dark in manner. Deaf too. Not that I ever knew much of them. They'd only been here a month, you understand, when the thing happened. They say he'd been a rare good gardener in his time, though. Wonderful testimonials Miss Eleanor had with him. Was she interested in gardening? Asked Mr. Quinn softly. No sir, I couldn't say that she was. Not like some of the ladies around here who pay good money to gardeners and spend the whole of their time grubbing about on their knees as well. Foolishness, I call it. You see, Miss Lutto wasn't here very much except in the winter for hunting. The rest of the time she was up in London and away in those foreign seaside places where they say the French ladies don't so much as put a toe into the water for fear of spoiling their costumes, or so I've heard. Mr. Sawa smiled. There was no woman of any kind mixed up with Captain Harwell? He asked. Though his first theory was disposed of, he nevertheless clung to his idea. Mr. William J. shook his head. Nothing of that sort. Never a whisper of it. No, it's a dark mystery, that's what it is. And your theory? What do you yourself think? Persisted Mr. Sawa. What do I think? Yes. Don't know what to think. It's my belief as how he was done in. But who by, I can't say. I'll fetch you gentlemen the cheese. He stumped from the room bearing empty dishes. The storm, which had been quietening down, suddenly broke out with redoubled vigor. A flash of forked lightning and a great clap of thunder, close upon each other, made little Mr. Sawa jump. And before the last echoes of the thunder had died away, a girl came into the room carrying the advertised cheese. She was tall and dark and handsome in a sullen fashion of her own. Her likeness to the landlord of the Bells and Motley was apparent enough to proclaim her his daughter. "Good evening, Mary," said Mr. Quinn. "A stormy night?" She nodded. "I hate these stormy nights," she muttered. "You are afraid of thunder, perhaps," said Mr. Sathwaite kindly. "Afraid of thunder? Not me. There's little that I'm afraid of. No, but the storm sets them off talking. Talking the same thing over and over again like a lot of parrots. Father begins it. It reminds me, this does, of the night poor Harwell, and so on and so on." She turned on Mr. Quinn. "You've heard how he goes on. What's the sense of it? Can't anyone let past things be? A thing is only past when it is done with," said Mr. Quinn. "Isn't this done with? Suppose he wanted to disappear. These fine gentlemen do sometimes. You think he disappeared of his own free will? Why not? It would make better sense than to suppose a kind-hearted creature like Stephen Grant murdered him. What should he murder him for, I should like to know? Stephen had had a drop too much one day and spoke to him sourly like and got the sack for it. But what of it? He got another place just as good. Is that a reason to murder a man in cold blood? But surely, said Mr. Sawyer, the police were quite satisfied of his innocence. The police? What do the police matter? When Stephen comes into the bar of an evening, every man looks at him queer-like. They don't really believe he murdered Harwell, but they're not sure. And so they look at him sideways and edge away. Nice life for a man, to see people shrink away from you as though you were something different from the rest of folks. Why won't father hear of our getting married, Stephen and I? You can take your pigs to a better market, my girl. I've nothing against Stephen, but, well, we don't know, do we?" She stopped, her breast heaving with the violence of her resentment. "It's cruel, cruel, that's what it is," she burst out. "Stephen. That wouldn't hurt a fly, and all through life there'll be people who think he did. It's turning him queer and bitter, like I don't wonder, I'm sure. And the more he's like that, the more people think there must have been something in it." Again she stopped. Her eyes were fixed on Mr. Quinn's face as though something in it was drawing this outburst from her. "Can nothing be done?" said Mr. Sathwaite. He was genuinely distressed. The thing was, he saw it as inevitable. The very vagueness and unsatisfactoriness of the evidence against Stephen Grant made it the more difficult for him to disprove the accusation. The girl whirled round on him. "Nothing but the truth can help him," she cried. If Captain Harwell were to be found, if he was to come back, if the true rights of it were only known, she broke off with something very like a sob and hurried quickly from the room. "A fine-looking girl," said Mr. Sawyer. "A sad case altogether. I very much wish that something could be done about it." His kind heart was troubled. "We are doing what we can," said Mr. Quinn. "There is still nearly half an hour before your car can be ready." Mr. Sawyer stared at him. "You think we can come at the truth just by talking it over like this? You have seen much of life," said Mr. Quinn gravely, "more than most people." "Life has passed me by," said Mr. Sawyer bitterly, "but in so doing has sharpened your vision. Where others are blind, you can see, it is true," said Mr. Sawyer. "I am a great observer." He plumed himself complacently. The moment of bitterness was past. "I look at it like this," he said after a minute or two. "To get at the cause for a thing, we must study the effect." "Very good," said Mr. Quinn approvingly. "The effect in this case is that Miss Luto, Mrs. Harwell, I mean, is a wife and yet not a wife. She is not free. She cannot marry again. And look at it as we will, we see Richard Harwell is a sinister figure. A man from nowhere with a mysterious past." "I agree," said Mr. Quinn. "You see, we are all bound to see what cannot be missed. Captain Harwell in the limelight, a suspicious figure." Mr. Sawyer looked at him doubtfully. The words seemed somehow to suggest a faintly different picture to his mind. "We have studied the effect," he said, "or call it the result. We can now pass," Mr. Quinn interrupted him. "You have not touched on the result on the strictly material side." "You are right," said Mr. Sawyer after a moment or two for consideration. "One should do the thing thoroughly. Let us say, then, that the result of the tragedy is that Mrs. Harwell is a wife and not a wife, unable to marry again. That Mr. Cyrus Bradburn has been able to buy Ashley GRA and its contents for £60,000, was it? And that somebody in Essex has been able to secure John Matthias as a gardener. For all that, we do not suspect somebody in Essex or Mr. Cyrus Bradburn of having engineered the disappearance of Captain Harwell." "You are sarcastic," said Mr. Quinn. Mr. Sawyer looked sharply at him. "But surely you agree." "Oh, I agree," said Mr. Quinn. "The idea is absurd. What next? Let us imagine ourselves back on the fatal day. The disappearance has taken place, let us say, this very morning." "No, no," said Mr. Quinn, smiling. "Since in our imagination at least we have power over time, let us turn it the other way. Let us say the disappearance of Captain Harwell took place 100 years ago, that we in the year 2025 are looking back." "You are a strange man," said Mr. Sawyer slowly. "You believe in the past, not the present. Why? You used not long ago the word atmosphere. There is no atmosphere in the present." "That is true, perhaps," said Mr. Sawyer thoughtfully. "Yes, it is true. The present is apt to be parochial." "A good word," said Mr. Quinn. Mr. Sawyer gave a funny little bow. "You are too kind," he said. "Let us take not this present year. That would be too difficult, but say last year," continued the other. "Sum it up for me, you, who have the gift of the neat phrase." Mr. Sawyer thought for a minute. He was jealous of his reputation. 100 years ago, we had the age of powder and patches, he said. Shall we say that 1924 was the age of crossword puzzles and cat burglars? Very good, approved Mr. Quinn. You mean that nationally, not internationally, I presume? As to crossword puzzles, I must confess that I do not know, said Mr. Sathwa, but the cat burglar had a great innings on the continent. You remember that series of famous thefts from French chateaux? It is surmised that one man alone could not have done it. The most miraculous feats were performed to gain admission. There was a theory that a troupe of acrobats were concerned, the Clinnies. I once saw their performance, truly masterly. A mother, son, and daughter. They vanished from the stage in a rather mysterious fashion. But we are wandering from our subject. Not very far, said Mr. Quinn, only across the channel, where the French ladies will not wet their toes, according to our worthy host, said Mr. Sawyer, laughing. There was a pause. It seemed somehow significant. Why did he disappear? Cried Mr. Sawyer. Why? Why? It is incredible. A kind of conjuring trick. Yes, said Mr. Quinn, a conjuring trick, that describes it exactly. Atmosphere again, you see. And wherein does the essence of a conjuring trick lie? The quickness of the hand deceives the eye. Quoted Mr. Sawyer glibly. That is everything, is it not? To deceive the eye, sometimes by the quickness of the hand, sometimes by other means. There are many devices, the pistol shot, the waving of a red handkerchief, something that seems important but in reality is not. The eye is diverted from the real business. It is caught by the spectacular action that means nothing, nothing at all. Mr. Sawyer leaned forward, his eyes shining. There is something in that. It is an idea, he went on softly. The pistol shot. What was the pistol shot in the conjuring trick we were discussing? What is the spectacular moment that holds the imagination? He drew in his breath sharply. The disappearance, breathed Mr. Sawyer. Take that away and it leaves nothing, nothing. Suppose things took the same course without that dramatic gesture. You mean supposing Miss Ludo was still to sell Ashley Grange and leave for no reason? Well, why not? It would have aroused talk, I suppose. There would have been a lot of interest displayed in the value of the contents wait. He was silent a minute, then burst out, you are right. There is too much limelight, the limelight on Captain Harwell. And because of that, she has been in shadow. Miss Ludo, everyone asking, who is Captain Harwell? Where did he come from? But because she is the injured party, no one makes inquiries about her. Was she really a French Canadian? Were those wonderful heirlooms really handed down to her? You were right when you said just now that we had not wandered far from our subject, only across the channel. Those so-called heirlooms were stolen from the French chateau, most of them valuable, rare, and, in consequence, difficult to dispose of. She buys the house for a mere song, probably settles down there, and pays a good sum to an irreproachable Englishwoman to chaperone her. Then he comes. The plot is laid beforehand, the marriage, the disappearance, and the 9 days' wonder. What more natural than that a broken-hearted woman should want to sell everything that reminds her of her past happiness? The American is a connoisseur. The things are genuine and beautiful, some of them beyond price. He makes an offer, she accepts it. She leaves the neighborhood, a sad and tragic figure. The great coup has come off. The eye of the public has been deceived by the quickness of the hand and the spectacular nature of the trick. Mr. Sawyer paused, flushed with triumph. But for you, I should never have seen it, he said with sudden humility. You have a most curious effect upon me. One says things so often without even seeing what they really mean. You have the knack of showing one. But it is still not quite clear to me. It must have been most difficult for Harwell to disappear as he did. After all, the police all over England were looking for him. They were probably looking, said Mr. Quinn, all over England. It would have been simplest to remain hidden at the GRA. Used, Mr. Sawyer, if it could be managed. He was, I think, very near the GRA, said Mr. Quinn. His look of significance was not lost on Mr. Sawyer. Matthias's cottage, he exclaimed. But the police must have searched it repeatedly. I should imagine, said Mr. Quinn. Matthias, said Mr. Sawyer, frowning. And Mrs. Matthias, said Mr. Quinn. Mr. Sawyer stared hard at him. If that gang was really the Clinneys, he said dreamily, there were 3 of them in it. The 2 young ones were Harwell and Eleanor Ludo. The mother, now, was she Mrs. Matthias? But in that case, Matthias suffered from rheumatism, did he not? Said Mr. Quinn innocently. Oh, cried Mr. Sawyer. I have it. But could it be done? I believe it could. Listen. Matthias was there a month. During that time, Harwell and Eleanor were away for a fortnight on a honeymoon. For the fortnight before the wedding. They were supposedly in town. A clever man could have doubled the parts of Harwell and Matthias. When Harwell was at Kirtlington Mallet, Matthias was conveniently laid up with rheumatism, with Mrs. Matthias to sustain the fiction. Her part was very necessary. Without her, someone might have suspected the truth. As you say, Harwell was hidden in Matthias's cottage. He was Matthias. When at last the plans matured and Ashley Grange was sold, he and his wife gave out that they were taking a place in Essex. Exit John Matthias and his wife forever. There was a knock at the coffee-room door and Masters entered. The car is at the door, sir, he said. Mr. Sawyer rose, so did Mr. Quinn, who went across to the window, pulling the curtains. A beam of moonlight streamed into the room. The storm is over, he said. Mr. Sawyer was pulling on his gloves. "The commission is dining with me next week," he said importantly. "I shall put my theory before him, it will be easily proved or disproved," said Mr. Quinn. A comparison of the objects at Ashley Grange with a list supplied by the French police. "Ah, just so," said Mr. Sawyer. "Rather hard luck on Mr. Bradburn, but, well, he can, I believe, stand the loss," said Mr. Quinn. Mr. Sawyer held out his hand. "Goodbye," he said. "I cannot tell you how much I've appreciated this unexpected meeting. You are leaving here tomorrow, I think you said, possibly tonight. My business here is done. I come and go, you know." Mr. Sawyer remembered hearing those same words earlier in the evening. Rather curious. He went out to the car and the waiting masters. From the open door into the bar, the landlord's voice floated out, rich and complacent. "A recent dark mystery," he was saying. "A dark mystery, that's what it is." But he did not use the word dark. The word he used suggested quite a different color. Mr. William Jones was a man of discrimination who suited his adjectives to his company. The company in the bar liked their adjectives full-flavored. Mr. Sawyer reclined luxuriously in the comfortable limousine. His breast swelled with triumph. He saw the girl Mary come out on the steps and stand under the creaking sign. "She little knows," said Mr. Sawyer to himself. "She little knows what I am going to do." The sign of the Bells and Motley swayed gently in the wind. Agatha Christie, the voice in the dark. "I am a little worried about Marjorie," said Lady Strandy. "My girl, you know," she added. She sighed pensively. "It makes one feel terribly old to have a grown-up daughter." Mr. Sawyer, who was the recipient of these confidences, rose to the occasion gallantly. "No one could believe it possible," he declared with a little bow. "Flatterer," said Lady Stanley, but she said it vaguely, and it was clear that her mind was elsewhere. Mr. Sawyer looked at the slender, white-clad figure in some admiration. The ray of sunshine was searching, but Lady Stanley came through the test very well. At a distance, the youthful effect was really extraordinary. One almost wondered if she were grown up or not. Mr. Sawyer, who knew everything, knew that it was perfectly possible for Lady Stanley to have grown-up grandchildren. She represented the extreme triumph of art over nature. Her figure was marvelous, her complexion was marvelous. She had enriched many beauty parlors, and certainly, the results were astounding. Lady Stanley lit a cigarette, crossed her beautiful legs encased in the finest of nude silk stockings, and murmured, "Yes, I really am rather worried about Marjorie." "Dear me," said Mr. Sawyer, "what is the trouble?" Lady Stanley turned her beautiful blue eyes upon him. "You have never met her, have you? She is Charles's daughter," she added helpfully. If entries in Who's Who were strictly truthful, the entries concerning Lady Stanley might have ended as follows: hobbies, getting married. She had floated through life, shedding husbands as she went. She had lost 3 by divorce and 1 by death. If she had been Rudolph's child, I could have understood it, mused Lady Stanley. You remember Rudolph? He was always temperamental. 6 months after we married, I had to apply for those queer things, what do they call them? Conjugal whatnot. You know what I mean. Thank goodness it is all much simpler nowadays. I remember I had to write him the silliest kind of letter. My lawyer practically dictated it to me, asking him to come back, you know, and that I would do all I could, etc. But you never could count on Rudolph, he was so temperamental. He came rushing home at once, which was quite the wrong thing to do and not at all what the lawyers meant. She sighed about Marjorie, suggested Mr. Sawyer tactfully, leading her back to the subject under discussion. Of course, I was just going to tell you, wasn't I? Marjorie has been seeing things or hearing them, ghosts, you know, and all that. I should never have thought that Marjorie could be so imaginative. She is a dear, good girl, always has been, but just a shade dull. Impossible, murmured Mr. Sawyer, with a confused idea of being complimentary. In fact, very dull, said Lady Strandley. She doesn't care for dancing or cocktails or any of the things a young girl ought to care about. She much prefers staying at home to hunt instead of coming out here with me. Dear, dear, said Mr. Sathwa. She wouldn't come out with you, you say? Well, I didn't exactly press her. Daughters have a depressing effect upon one, I find. Mr. Sathwa tried to think of Lady Strandley accompanied by a serious-minded daughter and failed. I can't help wondering if Marjorie is going off her head, continued Marjorie's mother in a cheerful voice. Hearing voices is a very bad sign, so they tell me. It is not as though Abbotsmere were haunted. The old building was burnt to the ground in 1836, and they put up a kind of early Victorian shadow, which simply cannot be haunted. It is much too ugly and commonplace. Mr. Sawyer coughed. He was wondering why he was being told all this. I thought perhaps, said Lady Strandley, smiling brilliantly upon him, that you might be able to help me. Yes. You're going back to England tomorrow, aren't you? I am, yes, that is so, admitted Mr. Sathwa cautiously. And you know all these psychical research people? Of course, you do. You know everybody. Mr. Sathwa smiled a little. It was one of his weaknesses to know everybody. So what can be simpler, continued Lady Strandley. I never get on with that sort of person, you know, earnest men with beards and usually spectacles. They bore me terribly, and I'm quite at my worst with them. Mr. Sathwa was rather taken aback. Lady Stanley continued to smile at him brilliantly. So that is all settled, isn't it? She said brightly. You will go down to Abbotsmere and see Marjorie and make all the arrangements. I shall be terribly grateful to you. Of course, if Marjorie is really going off her head, I will come home. Ah, here is Bimbo. Her smile, from being brilliant, became dazzling. A young man in white tennis flannels was approaching them. He was about 25 years of age and extremely good-looking. The young man said simply, I have been looking for you everywhere, Babs. What has the tennis been like? Septic, Lady Stanley rose. She turned her head over her shoulder and murmured in dulcet tones to Mr. Sathwa, It is simply marvelous of you to help me. I shall never forget it. Mr. Sathwa looked after the retreating couple. I wonder, he mused to himself, if Bimbo is going to be number 5, too. The conductor of the train to Lux was pointing out to Mr. Sawyer where an accident on the line had occurred a few years previously. As he finished his spirited narrative, the other looked up and saw a well-known face smiling at him over the conductor's shoulder. My dear Mr. Quinn, said Mr. Sawyer. His little withered face broke into smiles. What a coincidence that we should both be returning to England on the same train. You are going there, I suppose? Yes, said Mr. Quinn. I have business there of rather an important nature. Are you taking the first service of dinner? I always do so. Of course, it is an absurd time, 6:30, but one runs less risk with the cooking. Mr. Quinn nodded, comprehending. I also, he said. We might perhaps arrange to sit together. 6:30 found Mr. Quinn and Mr. Sawyer established opposite each other at a small table in the dining car. Mr. Sawyer gave due attention to the wine list and then turned to his companion. I have not seen you since, yes, not since Corsica. You left very suddenly that day. Mr. Quinn shrugged his shoulders. Not more so than usual. I come and go, you know, I come and go. The words seemed to awaken some echo of remembrance in Mr. Sawyer's mind. A little shiver passed down his spine, not a disagreeable sensation, quite the contrary. He was conscious of a pleasurable sense of anticipation. Mr. Quinn was holding up a bottle of red wine, examining the label on it. The bottle was between him and the light, but for a minute or two, a red glow enveloped his person. Mr. Sawyer felt again that sudden stir of excitement. "I too have a kind of mission in England," he remarked, smiling broadly at the remembrance. "You know Lady Stanley, perhaps?" Mr. Quinn shook his head. "It is an old title," said Mr. Sawyer, "a very old title, one of the few that can descend in the female line. She is a baroness in her own right. Rather a romantic history, really." Mr. Quinn settled himself more comfortably in his chair. A waiter, flying down the swinging car, deposited cups of soup before them as if by a miracle. Mr. Quinn sipped it cautiously. "You are about to give me one of those wonderful descriptive portraits of yours," he murmured. "That is so, is it not?" Mr. Sawyer beamed on him. "She is really a marvelous woman," he said. 60, you know." "Yes, I should say at least 60. I knew them as girls, she and her sister Beatrice. That was the name of the elder one, Beatrice and Barbara. I remember them as the Baron girls, both good-looking and, in those days, very hard up. But that was a great many years ago. Why, dear me, I was a young man myself then." Mr. Sawyer sighed. There were several lives then between them and the title. Old Lord Strandy was a first cousin once removed, I think. Lady Stanley's life has been quite a romantic affair, 3 unexpected deaths. 2 of the old man's brothers and a nephew. Then there was the Urala. You remember the wreck of the Urala? She went down off the coast of New Zealand. The Baron girls were on board. Beatrice was drowned. This one, Barbara, was amongst the few survivors. 6 months later, old Stanley died, and she succeeded to the title and came into a considerable fortune. Since then, she has lived for one thing only, herself. She has always been the same, beautiful, unscrupulous, completely callous, interested solely in herself. She has had 4 husbands, and I have no doubt could get a 5th in a minute." He went on to describe the mission with which he had been entrusted by Lady Strandy. "I thought of running down to Abbotsmy to see the young lady," he explained. I feel that something ought to be done about the matter. It is impossible to think of Lady Strandy as an ordinary mother." He stopped, looking across the table at Mr. Quinn. "I wish you would come with me," he said wistfully. "Would it not be possible?" "I'm afraid not," said Mr. Quinn. "But let me see. Abbotsmy is in Wiltshire, is it not?" Mr. Sawyer nodded. "I thought as much. As it happens, I shall be staying not far from Abbotsmy at a place you and I both know." He smiled. "You remember that little inn, the Bells and Motley?" "Of course," cried Mr. Sawyer. "You will be there?" Mr. Quinn nodded. "For a week or 10 days, possibly longer. If you will come and look me up one day, I shall be delighted to see you." And somehow or other, Mr. Sawyer felt strangely comforted by the assurance. "My dear Miss, Marjorie," said Mr. Sawyer, "I assure you that I should not dream of laughing at you." Marjorie Gale frowned a little. They were sitting in the large, comfortable hall of Abbotsmy. Marjorie Gale was a big, squarely built girl. She bore no resemblance to her mother but took entirely after her father's side of the family, a line of hard-riding country squires. She looked fresh and wholesome and the picture of sanity. Nevertheless, Mr. Sathwell was reflecting to himself that the Barons, as a family, were all inclined to mental instability. Marjorie might have inherited her physical appearance from her father and, at the same time, have inherited some mental kink from her mother's side of the family. "I wish," said Marjorie, "that I could get rid of that Casson woman. I don't believe in spiritualism, and I don't like it. She is one of these silly women that run a craze to death. She is always bothering me to have a medium down here." Mr. Sawyer coughed, fidgeted a little in his chair, and then said in a judicial manner, let me be quite sure that I have all the facts. The first of the, phenomena occurred 2 months ago, I understand? About that, agreed the girl. Sometimes it was a whisper, and sometimes it was quite a clear voice, but it always said much the same thing, which was, give back what is not yours. Give back what you have stolen. On each occasion, I switched on the light, but the room was quite empty, and there was no one there. In the end, I got so nervous that I got Clayton, mother's maid, to sleep on the sofa in my room, and the voice came just the same. Yes, and this is what frightens me. Clayton did not hear it. Mr. Sawyer reflected for a minute or two. Did it come loudly or softly? That evening it was almost a whisper, admitted Marjorie. If Clayton was sound asleep, I suppose she would not really have heard it. She wanted me to see a doctor, the girl laughed bitterly, but since last night even Clayton believes, she continued. What happened last night? I am just going to tell you. I told no one as yet. I had been out hunting yesterday, and we had had a long run. I was dead tired and slept very heavily. I dreamt a horrible dream that I had fallen over some iron railings and that one of the spikes was entering slowly into my throat. I woke to find that it was true, there was some sharp point pressing into the side of my neck, and at the same time, a voice was murmuring softly, "You have stolen what is mine. This is death." I screamed, continued Marjorie, and clutched at the air, but there was nothing there. Clayton heard me scream from the room next door where she was sleeping. She came rushing in, and she distinctly felt something brushing past her in the darkness, but she says that whatever that something was, it was not anything human. Mr. Sawyer stared at her. The girl was obviously very shaken and upset. He noticed on the left side of her throat a small square of sticking plaster. She caught the direction of his gaze and nodded. Yes, she said, it was not imagination, you see. Mr. Sathwa put a question almost apologetically. It sounded so melodramatic. You don't know of anyone, who has a grudge against you? He asked. Of course not, said Marjorie. What an idea. Mr. Sawyer started on another line of attack. What visitors have you had during the last 2 months? You don't mean just people for weekends, I suppose. Mara Keene has been with me all along. She's my best friend and just as keen on horses as I am. Then my cousin Roy Vavas has been here a good deal. Mr. Sawyer nodded. He suggested that he should see Clayton, the maid. She has been with you a long time, I suppose? He asked. Donkey's years, said Marjorie. She was Mother's and Aunt Beatrice's maid when they were girls. That is why Mother has kept her on, I suppose, although she has got a French maid for herself. Clayton does sewing and pottering, little odd jobs. She took him upstairs, and presently, Clayton came to them. She was a tall, thin old woman with gray hair neatly parted, and she looked the acme of respectability. No, sir, she said in answer to Mr. Sawyer's inquiries, I have never heard anything of the house being haunted, to tell you the truth, sir. I thought it was all Miss Marjorie's imagination until last night, but I actually felt something brushing by me in the darkness, and I can tell you this, sir, it was not anything human. And then there is that wound in Miss Marjorie's neck. She didn't do that herself, poor lamb. But her words were suggestive to Mr. Sathwa. Was it possible that Marjorie could have inflicted that wound herself? He had heard of strange cases where girls, apparently just as sane and well-balanced as Marjorie, had done the most amazing things. It will soon heal up, said Clayton. It's not like this scar of mine. She pointed to a mark on her own forehead. That was done 40 years ago, sir. I still bear the mark of it. It was the time the Alia went down, put in Marjorie. Clayton was hit on the head by a spar, weren't you, Clayton? Yes, Mississippi. What do you think yourself, Clayton? Asked Mr. Swee. What do you think was the meaning of this attack on Miss Marjorie? I really should not like to say, sir. Mr. Sathwa read this correctly as the reserve of the well-trained servant. "What do you really think, Clayton?" he said persuasively. "I think, sir, that something very wicked must have been done in this house and that until that is wiped out, there won't be any peace." The woman spoke gravely, and her faded blue eyes met his steadily. Mr. Sawyer went downstairs rather disappointed. Clayton evidently held the orthodox view, a deliberate haunting as a consequence of some evil deed in the past. Mr. Sawyer himself was not so easily satisfied. The phenomena had only taken place in the last 2 months, had only taken place since Maria Keene and Roy Vassor had been there. He must find out something about these two. It was possible that the whole thing was a practical joke, but he shook his head, dissatisfied with that solution. The thing was more sinister than that. The post had just come in, and Marjorie was opening and reading her letters. Suddenly she gave an exclamation. "Mother is too absurd," she said. "Do read this." She handed the letter to Mr. Sawyer. It was an epistle typical of Lady Strandy. "Darling Marjorie," she wrote, "I am so glad you have that nice little Mr. Sathwaite there. He is awfully clever and knows all the bigwig spook people. You must have them all down and investigate things thoroughly. I am sure you will have a perfectly marvelous time, and I only wish I could be there, but I have really been quite ill the last few days. The hotels are so careless about the sweet of you to send me the chocolates, darling, but surely just a wee bit silly, wasn't it? I mean there's such wonderful confectionery out here. Bye-bye, darling, and have a lovely time laying the family ghosts. Bimbo says my tennis is coming on marvelously. Oceans of love, yours, Barbara." "Mother always wants me to call her Barbara," said Marjorie. "Simply silly, I think." Mr. Sathwa smiled a little. He realized that the stolid conservatism of her daughter must on occasions be very trying to Lady Stanley. The contents of her letter struck him in a way in which obviously they did not strike Marjorie. "Did you send your mother a box of chocolates?" he asked. Marjorie shook her head. "No, I didn't. It must have been someone else." Mr. Sawyer looked grave. 2 things struck him as of significance. Lady Strandy had received, read, a gift of a box of chocolates, and she was suffering from a severe attack of poisoning. Apparently, she had not connected these 2 things. Was there a connection? He himself was inclined to think there was. A tall dark girl lounged out of the morning room and joined them. She was introduced to Mr. Sawyer as Mara Keene. She smiled on the little man in an easy, good-humored fashion. "Have you come down to hunt Marjorie's pet ghost?" she asked in a drawling voice. "We all hear about that ghost. Hello, here's Rolly." A car had just drawn up at the front door. Out of it tumbled a tall young man with fair hair and an eager boyish manner. "Hello, Marjorie," he cried. "Hello, Mara. I've brought down reinforcements." He turned to the 2 women who were just entering the hall. Mr. Sawyer recognized in the first one of the 2 the Mrs. Casson of whom Marjorie had spoken just now. "You must forgive me, Mar dear," she drawled, smiling broadly. "Mr. Vassor told us that it would be quite all right. It was really his idea that I should bring down Mrs. Lloyd with me." She indicated her companion with a slight gesture of the hand. "This is Mrs. Lloyd," she said in a tone of triumph, "simply the most wonderful medium that ever existed." Mrs. Lloyd uttered no modest protest. She bowed and remained with her hands crossed in front of her. She was a highly colored young woman of commonplace appearance. Her clothes were unfashionable but rather ornate. She wore a chain of moonstones and several rings. Marjorie Gale, as Mr. Sawyer could see, was not too pleased at this intrusion. She threw an angry look at Roy Vassor, who seemed quite unconscious of the offense he had caused. "Lunch is ready, I think," said Marjorie. "Good," said Mrs. Casson. We will hold a séance immediately afterwards. Have you got some fruit for Mrs. Lloyd? She never eats a solid meal before a séance. They all went into the dining room. The medium ate 2 bananas and an apple and replied cautiously and briefly to the various polite remarks which Marjorie addressed to her from time to time. Just before they rose from the table, she flung back her head suddenly and sniffed the air. There is something very wrong in this house. I feel it. Isn't she wonderful? Said Mrs. Casson in a low, delighted voice. Oh, undoubtedly, said Mr. Sawyer dryly. The séance was held in the library. The hostess was, as Mr. Sawyer could see, very unwilling. Only the obvious delight of her guests in the proceedings reconciled her to the ordeal. The arrangements were made with a good deal of care by Mrs. Casson, who was evidently well versed in those matters. The chairs were set around in a circle, the curtains were drawn, and presently the medium announced herself ready to begin. 6 people, she said, looking around the room. That is bad. We must have an uneven number. 7 is ideal. I get my best results out of a circle of 7. One of the servants suggested Roy. He rose. I will rout out the butler. Let us have Clayton, said Marjorie. Mr. Sawyer saw a look of annoyance pass over Rolly Verk's good-looking face. But why Clayton? He demanded. You don't like Clayton, said Marjorie slowly. Rolly shrugged his shoulders. Clayton doesn't like me, he said whimsically. In fact, she hates me like poison. He waited a minute or two, but Marjorie did not give way. All right, he said. Have her down. The circle was formed. There was a period of silence, broken by the usual coughs and fidgeting. Presently, a succession of raps was heard, and then the voice of the medium's control, a red Indian called Cherokee. Indian brave says you good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Someone here very anxious to speak, someone here very anxious to give message to young lady. I go now. The spirits say what she come to say. A pause, and then a new voice, that of a woman, said softly, Is Marjorie here? Roy Vassor took it upon himself to answer. Yes, he said. She is. Who's that speaking? I am Beatrice. Beatrice who? To everyone's annoyance, the voice of the Red Indian Cherokee was heard once more. I have message for all of you people. Life here very bright and beautiful. We all work very hard to help those who have not yet passed over. Again, a silence, and then the woman's voice was heard once more. This is Beatrice speaking. Beatrice who? Beatrice Barton. Mr. Sawyer leaned forward, he was very excited. Beatrice Barton, who was drowned in the Aurelia. Yes, that is right. I remember the Aurelia. I have a message for this house. Give back what is not yours. I don't understand, said Marjorie helplessly. Oh, are you really Aunt Beatrice? Yes, I am your aunt. Of course she is, said Mrs. Casson reproachfully. How can you be so suspicious? The spirits don't like it. And suddenly Mr. Sawyer thought of a very simple test. His voice quivered as he spoke. Do you remember Mr. Bacchetti? He asked. Immediately, there came a ripple of laughter. Poor old Boats Upsetty, of course. Mr. Sathwell was dumbfounded. The test had succeeded. It was an incident of over 40 years ago, which had happened when he and the Barron girls had found themselves at the same seaside resort. A young Italian acquaintance of theirs had gone out in a boat and capsized, and Beatrice Barron had jestingly named him Boats Upsetty. It seemed impossible that anyone in the room could know of this incident except himself. The medium stirred and groaned. She is coming out, said Mrs. Casson. That is all we will get out of her today, I'm afraid. The daylight shone once more on the room full of people, 2 of whom at least were badly scared. Mr. saw by Marjorie's white face that she was deeply perturbed. When they had got rid of Mrs. Casson and the medium, he sought a private interview with his hostess. "I want to ask you one or two questions, Miss Marjorie. If you and your mother were to die, who succeeds to the title and estates?" "Re Vassor, I suppose. His mother was mother's first cousin." Mr. Saw nodded. "He seems to have been here a lot this winter," he said gently. "You will forgive me asking, but is he fond of you?" "He asked me to marry him 3 weeks ago," said Marjorie quietly. "I said no. Please forgive me, but are you engaged to anyone else?" He saw the color sweep over her face. "I am," she said emphatically. "I am going to marry No Barton. Mother laughs and says it is absurd. She seems to think it is ridiculous to be engaged to a curate." "Why, I should like to know." "There are cur and curates you should see Null on a horse." "Oh, quite so," said Mr. Saw. "Oh, undoubtedly." A footman entered with a telegram on a salver. Marjorie tore it open. "Mother is arriving home tomorrow," she said. "Bother. I wish to goodness she would stay away." Mr. Saw made no comment on this filial sentiment. Perhaps he thought it justified. "In that case," he murmured, "I think I am returning to London." The voice in the dark, a 4. Mr. Saw was not quite pleased with himself. He felt that he had left this particular problem in an unfinished state. True that on Lady Stanley's return his responsibility was ended, yet he felt assured that he had not heard the last of the Abbotsme mystery. But the next development, when it came, was so serious in its character that it found him totally unprepared. He learned of it in the pages of his morning paper. "Baroness dies in her bath," as the Daily Megaphone had it. The other papers were more restrained and delicate in their language, but the fact was the same: Lady Stanley had been found dead in her bath, and her death was due to drowning. She had, it was assumed, lost consciousness, and whilst in that state her head had slipped below the water. But Mr. Saw was not satisfied with that explanation. Calling for his valet, he made his toilet with less than his usual care, and 10 minutes later his big Rolls-Royce was carrying him out of London as fast as it could travel. But, strangely enough, it was not for Abbotsme he was bound, but for a small inn some 15 miles distant which bore the rather unusual name of the Bells and Motley. It was with great relief that he heard that Mr. Harley Quinn was still staying there. In another minute he was face to face with his friend. Mr. Saw clasped him by the hand and began to speak at once in an agitated manner. "I am terribly upset. You must help me. Already I have a dreadful feeling that it may be too late, that that nice girl may be the next to go, for she is a nice girl, nice through and through. If you will tell me," said Mr. Quinn, smiling, "what it is all about." Mr. Sathwa looked at him reproachfully. "You know, I am perfectly certain that you know, but I will tell you." He poured out the story of his stay at Abbotsme and, as always with Mr. Quinn, he found himself taking pleasure in his narrative. He was eloquent and subtle and meticulous as to detail. "So you see," he ended, "there must be an explanation." He looked hopefully at Mr. Quinn, as a dog looks at his master. "But it is you who must solve the problem, not I," said Mr. Quinn. "I do not know these people." "You do. I knew the Baron girls 40 years ago," said Mr. Saw with pride. Mr. Quinn nodded and looked sympathetic, so much so that the other went on dreamily. "That time at Brighton, now be, Chetty boats upty, quite a silly joke, but how we laughed. Dear, dear, I was young then, did a lot of foolish things. I remember the maid they had with them, Alice, her name was, a little bit of a thing, very ingenuous. I kissed her in the passage of the hotel, I remember, and one of the girls nearly caught me doing it. Dear, dear, how long ago that all was." He shook his head again and sighed. Then he looked at Mr. Quinn. "So you can't help me," he said wistfully. On other occasions you have proved successful." Owing entirely to your own efforts, said Mr. Quinn gravely. I think it will be the same this time. If I were you, I should go to Abbotsmy now. Quite so, said Mr. Sawyer. As a matter of fact, that is what I thought of doing. I can't persuade you to come with me. Mr. Quinn shook his head. No, he said. My work here is done. I am leaving almost immediately. At Abbotsmy, Mr. Sawyer was taken at once to Marjorie Gale. She was sitting dry-eyed at a desk in the morning room, on which was strewn various papers. Something in her greeting touched him. She seemed so very pleased to see him. Rowley, and Mara have just left. Mr. Sawyer, it is not as the doctors think. I am convinced, absolutely convinced, that Mother was pushed under the water and held there. She was murdered, and whoever murdered her wants to murder me too. I am sure of that. That is why, she indicated the document in front of her, I have been making my will, she explained. A lot of the money and some of the property do not go with the title, and there is my father's money as well. I am leaving everything I can to Noel. I know he will make good use of it, and I do not trust Rowley. He has always been out for what he can get. Will you sign it as a witness? My dear young lady, said Mr. Sawyer, you should sign a will in the presence of 2 witnesses, and they should then sign themselves at the same time. Marjorie brushed aside this legal pronouncement. I don't see that it matters in the least, she declared. Clayton saw me sign, and then she signed her name. I was going to ring for the butler, but you will do instead. Mr. Sawyer uttered no fresh protest. He unscrewed his fountain pen, and then, as he was about to append his signature, he paused suddenly. The name written just above his own recalled a flow of memories, Alice Clayton. Something seemed to be struggling very hard to get through to him. Alice Clayton, there was some significance about that, something to do with Mr. Quinn. It was mixed up with it, something he had said to Mr. Quinn only a very short time ago. Ah, he had it now, Alice Clayton, that was her name. The little bit of a thing. People changed, yes, but not like that, and the Alice Clayton he knew had had brown eyes. The room seemed whirling around him. He felt for a chair, and presently, as though from a great distance, he heard Marjorie's voice speaking to him anxiously. Are you ill? Oh, what is it? I'm sure you are ill. He was himself again. He took her hand. My dear, I see it all now. You must prepare yourself for a great shock. The woman upstairs, whom you call Clayton, is not Clayton at all. The real Alice Clayton was drowned on the Eurelia. Marjorie was staring at him. Who is she then? I am not mistaken. I cannot be mistaken. The woman you call Clayton is your mother's sister, Beatrix Barron. You remember telling me that she was struck on the head by a spar? I should imagine that that blow destroyed her memory, and that being the case, your mother saw the chance of pinching the title. You mean, asked Marjorie bitterly, yes, she would do that. It seems dreadful to say that now she is dead, but she was like that. Beatrix was the elder sister, said Mr. Sawyer. By your uncle's death, she would inherit everything, and your mother would get nothing. Your mother claimed the wounded girl as her maid, not as her sister. The girl recovered from the blow and believed, of course, what was told her, that she was Alice Clayton, your mother's maid. I should imagine that just lately her memory had begun to return, but that the blow on the head given all these years ago has at last caused mischief on the brain. Marjorie was looking at him with eyes of horror. She killed Mother, and she wanted to kill me, she breathed. It seems so, said Mr. Sawyer. In her brain, there was just one muddled idea, that her inheritance had been stolen and was being kept from her by you and your mother. But Clayton is so old. Mr. Sathwell was silent for a minute as a vision rose up before him, the faded old woman with grey hair and the radiant, golden-haired creature sitting in the sunshine at Consister's. Could it really be so? He remembered the barren girls and their likeness to each other. Just because two lives had developed on different tracks, he shook his head sharply. Obsessed by the wonder and pity of life, he turned to Marguerite and said gently, "We had better go upstairs and see her." They found Clayton sitting in the little workroom where she sewed. She did not turn her head as they came in. For a reason that Mr. Saw soon found out. "Heart failure," he murmured as he touched the cold, rigid shoulder. "Perhaps it is best that way."